Griffin Tate married a ghost on a Tuesday, signed papers with a woman who had no yesterday, and by Thursday night discovered her whispered name could stop locomotives dead in their iron tracks. The marriage had been practical, nothing more. Griffin needed a wife to keep the railway company from questioning a bachelor guard living alone in the depot house, and Nova Hastings, if that was truly her name, needed shelter from whatever shadows chased her across 3 territories. She'd arrived on the westbound at dawn, stepping onto the Devil's Bend platform with nothing but a carpetbag and eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. You can almost smell the desert dust that clung to her travel-worn dress. Mixed with something else, the metallic tang of fear and the faint sweetness of jasmine perfume that had no business in this godforsaken corner of Arizona territory. The morning sun carved her silhouette against the depot wall like a paper cutout, all sharp edges and careful angles, as if she'd learned to make herself smaller than the space she occupied. "I can cook and mend," she'd said, her voice carrying an accent Griffin couldn't place, sometimes Eastern refined, sometimes frontier rough, as if she'd learned to speak from different mouths. "I ask no questions, and I answer none that dig too deep." Griffin had studied her face, noting the way she held her left shoulder slightly forward, protecting old hurt. Her hands were soft enough for parlor work, but bore a thin scar across the knuckles that spoke of defending something precious. A wedding ring had once graced her finger. The pale band of skin told that story clear as scripture, but whatever vows she'd made before had been buried deeper than cemetery bones. Most telling of all, she never looked directly at the train that had brought her, as if the sight of those iron rails might drag her back into whatever hell she'd escaped. The depot clock chimed 7 times, each note hanging in the dry air like a prayer. Griffin found himself studying the way morning light caught the copper threads in her dark hair, the careful way she breathed, as if measuring each breath for later use. She was beautiful, he reckoned, but it was the kind of beauty that had been tested by fire and came out harder on the other side. Marriage would be in name only, Griffin had said, removing his conductor's cap and running fingers through hair premature silver from too many nights watching for train robbers in the desert dark. Company housing, shared meals, separate rooms. Nothing more expected. She'd nodded once, sharp and businesslike. When, 2 days later, Judge Callum Strickland performed the ceremony in his office while the noon freight thundered past, drowning out half the vows. Nova wore a blue dress that had seen better days but fit her like it was made for someone else, someone smaller, softer, less likely to scan every window for escape routes. Griffin's friend Heath Madden served as witness, his sheriff's badge, catching lamplight as he signed the register. "You sure about this, Griff?" Heath had muttered. "Woman's running from something fierce. Can see it in how she sleeps, one eye always open. Aren't we all running from something?" Griffin had replied, thinking of his own ghosts. The train crash 3 years back, the screaming metal and screaming people, the way silence had felt like dying when the dust finally settled. The first 2 months passed quietly enough. Nova proved herself handy with more than cooking and mending. She could calculate freight weights faster than Griffin's ledger book, spot track damage from a quarter-mile away, and had an uncanny sense for when trouble rode the rails. Her biscuits came out golden every morning, her mending was near invisible, and she kept the depot house cleaner than it had been since Griffin's mother passed. But it was the small things that began to unsettle him. The way she set the table for 3 people before catching herself and removing the extra plate. How she'd start to hum melodies that sounded like lullabies, then stop abruptly, as if the music hurt. The fact that she owned only 4 dresses but could describe the latest fashions from New York and San Francisco in perfect detail, as if she'd worn silk and velvet in another life. Twice she'd warned him about loose coupling pins that would have derailed the evening passenger service. Once she'd known, somehow, that the freight manifest had been doctored, saved the company $3,000 in stolen goods. When the territorial marshal came asking questions about the missing shipment, she'd disappeared into their bedroom and didn't emerge until his horse disappeared down the horizon. "How'd you know about the manifest numbers?" Griffin had asked after that incident, watching her pale fingers trace patterns on the depot house table, always the same pattern, like she was writing invisible letters. "Numbers tell stories," she'd said, not meeting his eyes. "You just have to know how to listen to what they're really saying beneath all the lies." But it was the way she listened to everything that unsettled him most. Nova could identify approaching trains by sound alone, knew whether they ran light or heavy, passenger or freight, eastbound or west. She'd freeze sometimes when the night trains passed, her whole body going tense as a drawn bowstring, lips moving in silent words Griffin couldn't catch. During these moments, the temperature in whatever room she occupied seemed to drop 10 degrees. And Griffin swore he could hear distant voices carried on the wind, voices speaking in that same musical language she whispered in her sleep. The change came on a Thursday night in October, when autumn had painted the desert in shades of rust and gold. Griffin was checking the signal lights when he heard it, Nova's voice carrying across the still air, speaking words in a language that sounded like music and morning combined. The syllables rolled off her tongue like water over river stones, each one deliberate and weighted with power he couldn't begin to understand. The westbound freight was approaching right on schedule, its headlamp cutting through darkness like a fallen star, its whistle announcing cargo bound for California ports. Engineer Dax Monroe was at the throttle. Griffin knew his whistle pattern like a signature. But as Nova's voice rose, something impossible happened. The train began to slow, its wheels fighting against momentum and physics, its whistle changing. Pitch from urgent warning to something almost like recognition. Like greeting. Like coming home after years in the wilderness. Griffin dropped his signal lantern, the glass shattering against desert hardpan, and ran toward the house. His boots thundered across the wooden platform, echoing like gunshots in the sudden quiet. He arrived just as the massive locomotive ground to a complete stop not 50 yards from the depot, its iron bulk settling with the groaning sighs of cooling metal. Steam hissed from its belly like a dying breath, and in the sudden silence that followed, Griffin could hear his wife weeping. Deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like a dam finally bursting after holding back years of grief. Nova. He found her on the porch, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at the motionless train. What did you do? She looked at him then with eyes full of terror and something else, relief, maybe, or resignation. My name, she whispered. My real name. It's not Nova Hastings, Griffin. It never was. The train's whistle gave one long, mournful cry that echoed across the desert like the voice of something lost finding its way home. In the distance, Griffin could see the engineer, climbing down from his cab, lantern in hand, moving toward them with the careful steps of a man approaching a miracle. Then what is it? Griffin asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything between them. Nova stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled like leaves before a storm. My name is Alara Ellis, she said, and even speaking it seemed to cost her something precious. And that train out there? It's been looking for me for 3 long years. But as the engineer's footsteps grew closer and Griffin saw the recognition dawning in the man's weathered face, he realized his ghost bride's past wasn't just catching up with them. It was about to drag them both into a reckoning that would test everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the price of redemption on the iron rails of the American frontier. The engineer climbing down from the locomotive wasn't Dax Monroe. Griffin's blood turned to desert ice as he recognized the weathered face emerging from the cab, Remy Navarro, a man who'd been buried 3 years ago after the Copper Ridge disaster. Griffin had seen the casket lowered into rocky ground, had thrown dirt on polished wood while Remy's widow wept him into her black handkerchief. Yet here he stood, boots hitting gravel with the solid thunk of living weight, lantern swinging, in a hand that should have been nothing but bone and dust. His conductor's uniform hung loose on a frame that seemed stretched thin, as if death had taken pounds along with years. But his eyes, Christ Almighty, his eyes burned with the same fierce intelligence that had made him the finest engineer on the whole Atchison line. Alara Ellis, Remy called across the distance, his voice carrying the hollow echo of wind through canyon walls. Been a long time, girl. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days. But who's counting? Nova, Alara, rose from the porch steps like smoke given form. The tears had stopped, leaving salt tracks on her cheeks that caught starlight. Hello, Remy. You look. She paused, studying his ghostly pallor. You look exactly like I remember. Griffin's hand dropped instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip, though what good bullets would do against a dead man was anybody's guess. Alara, he said, testing her real name on his tongue like bitter medicine. You want to tell me how you know a man who died in a train wreck? She turned to him then, and in her storm cloud eyes he saw a depth of pain that made his own ghosts seem like children's shadows. Because I killed him, Griffin. I killed him and 63 other souls when I made that train jump the rails at Copper Ridge. The night seemed to hold its breath. Even the desert wind went still, as if the very air was afraid to move. Griffin felt the world tilt sideways, like standing on a platform when an express train thundered past too close. That's not the whole truth, little sister, Remy said, moving closer with steps that made no sound on the gravel. Tell him about the name. Tell him about the gift your grandmother left you before the fever took her home. Alara's hands twisted in her skirts, the fabric bunching between white knuckles. My grandmother was different. Welsh blood, she said, though folks called it something else. She could speak to the iron horses, make them listen when reason failed. She taught me the old words, the ones that run deeper than steam and steel. Griffin's rational mind rebelled against what he was hearing, but the evidence stood 60 yards away, a locomotive that had no business stopping, and a dead man walking like Sunday afternoon. You're saying you can control trains? With words. Not control. Communicate. She looked toward the motionless freight, its headlamp casting their shadows long and strange across the depot platform. Every engine has a soul, Griffin, forged in fire and given purpose. They remember the hands that built them, the rails they've traveled, the cargo they've carried. And sometimes, when you know the right words, they remember the dead. Remy laughed. The sound like wind chimes made of bone. She was the finest dispatcher the Colorado and Southern ever had. Could coordinate 20 trains across 3 territories without a single delay. Until that October night when the wire came through. Special cargo, passenger priority, run the express line no matter what. What was the cargo? Griffin asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would damn them all. Children, Alara whispered, the word falling between them like a stone into still water. 15 orphans from the Denver home, being relocated to families in California. The railroad made deals, took money to move them fast and quiet. But the track through Copper Ridge was washed out from the October rains, and the company. Her voice cracked like breaking glass. The company said to run it anyway. Said the insurance would cover any losses. Griffin felt sick. He'd heard rumors about the Copper Ridge disaster, whispers of corporate negligence, and covered-up investigations. But hearing it from someone who'd been there, who'd lived with the weight of it, that was different. I tried to stop them, Alara continued, her words coming faster now, like water breaking through a dam. Used the telegraph, sent warnings down the line. But they'd already paid too much money to important people. So I did the only thing I could think of. I spoke to the engine in the old words, told her to stop before the bridge, no matter what. The engineer commanded. But she didn't stop, Remy said sadly. Did you, old girl? He patted the locomotive's iron flank with the tenderness of a man greeting an old horse. She tried, but the momentum was too great, the grade too steep. So instead, she chose where to die. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. In the distance, a coyote howled once and fell quiet, as if even the wild things knew better than to disturb this conversation between the living and the dead. The locomotive threw herself off the rails before the bridge, Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rolled down the embankment instead of taking the children over the canyon. She saved their lives by sacrificing her own and everyone. In the cab, Griffin looked from his wife to the dead engineer and back again, pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. That's why you ran. The railroad blamed you for the wreck. They needed someone to carry the guilt, Remy confirmed. Easier to blame a woman with strange ideas than admit their own greed killed good men. Put a bounty on her head, said she was touched in the mind. Made her disappear into the wind like smoke. But I deserved it, Alara said, tears starting fresh. Those men died because of what I did. You died, Remy, because I meddled with forces I didn't fully understand. The dead engineer's expression softened, and for a moment, Griffin could see the man he'd been in life. Kind eyes, gentle hands, the sort who'd give his coat to a stranger in winter. Child, you saved 15 innocent souls that night. We made our choice to ride that engine, knowing the risks. But those babies, he smiled, and it was the saddest, most beautiful thing Griffin had ever seen. They're all grown now, scattered across the West. Teachers and farmers, mothers and shopkeepers. Living good lives because you found the courage to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. But as Remy's words hung in the desert air like a benediction, Griffin heard something that made his blood run cold. The distant whistle of another train approaching from the east. Its call sharp and urgent and wrong, carrying a sound he'd never heard in 15 years of railroad work. The cry of something hunting, something that had finally caught the scent it had been tracking across half the continent. The hunting trains. Whistle cut through the night like a blade through silk. But this was no ordinary locomotive cry. This sound carried malice, a predatory shriek that made every window in the depot house rattle and sent every desert creature within miles scurrying for deeper holes. Griffin had heard wolves howl and mountain lions scream, but this was something else entirely. The voice of iron given terrible purpose. Alara went rigid as carved stone, her face draining of color until she looked almost as ghostly as Remy. "No," she breathed, the word barely audible above the approaching thunder of wheels on rails. "They found me. After all this time, they finally found me." "Who found you?" Griffin demanded, his hand tightening on his pistol grip. The rational part of his mind still insisted this was all some elaborate nightmare. But the rest of him was rapidly accepting that his quiet life guarding freight schedules had just collided with forces beyond his understanding. That Remy's spectral form flickered. Like candlelight in wind, his already pale features growing translucent. "The consortium," he said, and even speaking the name seemed to pain him. "The ones who paid for that death run through Copper Ridge. They don't forgive, and they surely don't forget." The approaching locomotive's headlamps swept around the distant bend, casting harsh white light across the desert scrub. But there was something wrong with that light. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and where it touched the ground, nothing cast shadows. Griffin squinted against the glare and felt his blood turn to winter water. The engine pulling into view was sleek. Black iron that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, and its smokestack belched not steam, but something that moved like liquid darkness against the stars. "Griffin," Alara said, her voice tight with controlled terror, "you need to get as far from here as possible. Take your horse and ride for Sheriff Madden's place. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." Like hell. Griffin stepped closer to his wife, close enough to smell the jasmine perfume that always seemed to cling to her hair. "I signed papers making you my responsibility. That means something." The dark train slowed as it approached the depot, its brakes screaming like tortured souls. You can almost taste the wrongness in the air now, metallic and sharp, like blood mixed with coal smoke. 3 figures dropped from the locomotive's cab before it came to a complete stop, and Griffin's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the man leading them. Indy Barton had been the Territorial Railroad Commissioner 3 years ago, a politician who'd worn expensive suits and made speeches about progress and prosperity. Now he wore the same black coat he'd been buried in, though death hadn't improved his disposition any. His companions were strangers to Griffin, but their pale skin and hungry eyes marked them as members of whatever unholy brotherhood had claimed Barton's soul. "Miss Ellis," Barton called across the platform, his voice carrying the hollow authority of the grave. "You've led us quite a chase across 3 territories. Time to come home and pay your debts." "I don't owe you anything," Alara replied, though Griffin could hear the tremor beneath her brave words. "I saved those children. I did what was right." Barton laughed, the sound like wind through a charnel house. "Night? Child, you cost us a very lucrative arrangement. The Denver orphanage was just the beginning. We had contracts with institutions across 6 states. Unwanted children, troublesome wards, the kind of cargo that disappears without anyone asking uncomfortable questions." Griffin felt sick understanding dawn like sunrise over hell. "You were trafficking children. We were solving problems," one of Barton's companions said, a thin man with silver hair and eyes like chips of black ice. "Overcrowded orphanages, families who couldn't feed extra mouths, institutions that needed space for more profitable residents. We provided solutions. And our little Welsh witch here disrupted a very profitable enterprise," Barton continued, moving closer with steps that left frost on the wooden platform despite the desert heat. "Cost us investors, scared off clients, forced us to find more creative ways to continue our work." Remy's ghostly form solidified slightly, positioning himself between the approaching dead men and Alara. You boys made your choice when you sold your souls for railroad stock. Leave the girl be. Oh, we intend to. Barton smiled, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished bone. But first, she's going to help us finish what we started. There are still trains to be run, cargo to be moved, profits to be made. And with her gift, we won't need to worry about inconvenient accidents or meddlesome consciences. Griffin's mind raced, trying to process the impossibility of what he was hearing. Dead men running phantom trains, trafficking in human misery, pursuing his wife across the territories for crimes that were really acts of mercy. It was madness, but it was madness that stood before him in the flesh, or whatever passed for flesh among the walking dead. The other children, Alara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the night air like a prayer. The ones you took after Copper Ridge. Where are they? Barton's smile widened. Gone to better places, child. Sold to mining companies that needed small hands for tight spaces. Shipped to factories where their size was an advantage. Some went to wealthy families who preferred servants that couldn't run home to mama. He paused, savoring her horror. And a few went to gentlemen with more specialized interests. Griffin had heard enough. His cold, cleared leather smooth as silk, the hammer cocking with a sound like breaking bone. You sick bastards, bullets. Won't stop us, boy. The silver-haired man said conversationally. We've already died once. What's the worst you can do, kill us again? But Alara stepped forward, her chin raised with a defiance that made Griffin's chest tight with pride and terror in equal measure. You want me to work for you? To use my grandmother's gift to help you steal more children? The thought had occurred to us, Barton admitted. Then you'll have to catch me first. Alara turned to the freight locomotive that had carried Remy to their reunion, placing both hands on its iron flank like a woman touching something sacred. Old girl, she whispered in that musical language Griffin was beginning to recognize. I know you're tired. I know you've carried enough sorrow for one lifetime. But I need to ask you for one more run. The locomotive shuddered, steam rising from her boiler like the breath of something waking from deep sleep. Her whistle sounded once, not the hunting cry of Barton's dark engine, but something pure and defiant, like a war song sung by angels. Get aboard, Remy called to Griffin and Alara, his ghostly form beginning to fade around the edges. She's got one more journey in her, but it won't be a gentle ride. Griffin grabbed Alara's hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of her hidden strength. Where are we going? The only place they can't follow, she replied, pulling him toward the locomotive's cab as behind them, Barton and his companions began to run across the platform with inhuman speed. We're going to find the children they stole, Griffin. We're going to bring them home. But as they hauled themselves into the cab and Remy's ghost took position at the throttle, Griffin realized that some journeys lead to places from which travelers never return, and the dark train behind them was already building steam for a chase that would determine not just their fate, but the souls of every stolen child scattered across the territories like seeds sown in cursed ground. The ghost locomotive screamed across the desert like a banshee given wheels, her pistons pumping with desperate fury as she carried the living and the dead toward a reckoning 3 years in the making. Griffin gripped the cab's iron rail until his knuckles went white, watching the speedometer needle climb past numbers that should have torn the rails from their beds. Behind them, Barton's dark engine pursued like a hound from hell, its malevolent headlamp casting twisted shadows that moved independently of their sources. Where exactly are we headed? Griffin shouted over the thunder of wheels and the shriek of steam. Kiera Wells, Alara called back, her hands moving over the locomotive's controls with the familiarity of a pianist at her keys. It's a mining town up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The consortium built a private spur line there, off the official maps. Remy's ghostly form wavered at the throttle, his spectral hands somehow able to manipulate solid metal. That's where they take the children first, he explained, his voice carrying despite the noise. Sort them, break their spirits, decide which ones go where. It's hidden in a canyon so deep the sun only touches the bottom for 2 hours each day. Griffin felt his gorge rise. How many? Last count we had was 47, Alara said, tears streaming down her cheeks as she spoke. Children from 6 territories, ranging from 5 years old to 15. The consortium's been building their operation for a decade, But after Copper Ridge, they moved everything to Kiera Wells. The pursuing locomotive's whistle shrieked again, closer now, its otherworldly cry making the very air vibrate with malice. Griffin risked a look back and saw that Barton's engine was gaining ground, its black iron frame cutting through the night like a knife through velvet. Worse, he could see figures moving on its roof. The dead men were preparing to board their locomotive. "They're coming up fast," Griffin warned, checking his pistol's cylinder out of habit. 6 bullets against the walking dead seemed like poor odds, but it was all he had. "Let them come," Ilera said grimly. She placed her palm against the locomotive's boiler and spoke words in the old language, her voice carrying notes that seemed to resonate in Griffin's bones. The engine responded immediately, her whistle changing pitch from desperate flight to something that sounded almost like laughter. That's when Griffin noticed they weren't following any tracks he recognized. The rails beneath them gleamed silver in the starlight, but they seemed to exist independently of the physical world, appearing just ahead of their locomotive and vanishing moments after they passed. They were riding on rails made of moonlight and determination, tracks that existed only because Ilera willed them into being. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Griffin breathed. "How is this possible?" "The iron remembers," Ilera explained, her voice tight with concentration as she maintained their impossible journey. "Every rail that was ever laid, every spike that was ever driven. They leave echoes in the world, ghost tracks that exist between what is and what was. My grandmother taught me to find them, to follow the paths that connect all railways across the continent." A thunderous crash shook their locomotive as something heavy landed on the roof above them. Dust and rust flakes showered down from the cab's ceiling, and Griffin heard the scrape of boots on metal. Barton's men had made the jump. "Stay here," Griffin told Ilera, pulling himself up toward the roof hatch. "Keep us on course." "Griffin, no," she called after him, but he was already hauling himself through the opening and into the wind-whipped chaos above. The locomotive's roof was a narrow catwalk of riveted steel, made treacherous by the speed and the supernatural forces at play. Griffin could see 2 of Barton's creatures moving toward him from the front of the engine, pale men in railroad uniforms, their eyes burning with the cold fire of the grave. One carried a railroad spike like a dagger, while the other had somehow armed himself with a length of iron chain. "Nothing personal, boy," the one with the spike called over the wind. "But you're harboring stolen property." Griffin's Colt spoke first, the shot echoing across the desert like thunder. The bullet took the speaker's center mass, spinning him around, but instead of falling, the creature straightened up and smiled, showing Griffin the hole punched clean through his chest. "Told you bullets wouldn't work," the dead man said cheerfully, and lunged. Griffin threw himself sideways, rolling across the locomotive's roof as the railroad spike scraped sparks from the metal where his head had been. The creature with the chain whipped it around in a deadly arc, forcing Griffin to duck and weave as he tried to find some advantage against opponents who couldn't be killed conventionally. That's when inspiration struck. If bullets wouldn't stop them, maybe the rails would. Griffin feinted left, then dove right, grabbing the creature with the chain around the waist and driving them both toward the edge of the locomotive. The dead man fought like a wildcat, his inhuman strength nearly breaking Griffin's grip, but momentum was on Griffin's side. They tumbled off the roof together, Griffin letting go at the last second to land hard on the narrow coupling platform. Between cars, the creature wasn't so lucky. He hit the ghost rails at 40 miles an hour and simply dissolved. Not torn apart or crushed, but unraveled like smoke in wind, his form scattering into component shadows that were swallowed by the rushing darkness. "Iron and speed," Griffin muttered, understanding flooding through him. "The rails themselves are like blessed ground to things that shouldn't exist." He hauled himself back up to face the remaining creature, who now looked considerably less confident. "Your friend didn't mention that part, did he?" Griffin called out. The spike-wielding dead man backed away, suddenly realizing he was trapped on a moving locomotive with an opponent who'd figured out the rules of this particular game. "You can't stop us all," he snarled. "There are more of us than you know, and we have forever to hunt her down." "Maybe," Griffin admitted, pulling a spare railroad spike from the locomotive's toolkit. "But you won't be around to see it." The fight was brief and brutal. The creature had supernatural strength and no fear of pain, But Griffin had desperation and the home field advantage. When it was over, another shadow form dissolved into the rushing wind, leaving Griffin alone on the locomotive's roof with aching ribs and the taste of his own blood in his mouth. He dropped back into the cab to find Alara maintaining their impossible course with grim determination, her face pale with exhaustion. "Two down," he reported. "But Barton's engine is still gaining." "I know," she said. "We're almost there. Can you see it?" Griffin looked ahead and felt his breath catch. Rising from the desert like a wound in the world was a canyon so deep and narrow it seemed to swallow starlight. But at its heart, impossibly, burned the lights of a town, lanterns and cook fires and the glow of forges, all nestled in a pocket of hell where no town should exist. "Kiera Wells," Alara said. "And somewhere down there, 47 children are waiting for someone to remember they exist." Their locomotive began the descent into the canyon, following rails that clung to the rock face like spider webs. Behind them, Barton's dark engine matched their every turn, its hunting cry echoing off the canyon walls in a symphony of pursuit and desperate flight. "Alara," Griffin said, reloading his pistol with hands that shook only slightly. "When we get down there, what's the plan?" She looked at him with eyes that held all the sorrow and determination in the world. "We're going to do what we should have done 3 years ago, Griffin. We're going to burn it all down and take those children home." But as their locomotive rounded the final bend and the full scope of Kiera Wells spread before them, a town built on stolen innocence and powered by human misery, Griffin realized that some battles aren't won with bullets or courage alone. And the choice between saving the children and saving themselves might be no choice at all. Kiera Wells sprawled across the canyon floor like a festering wound, its buildings hewn from black stone and mortared with despair. Griffin counted at least 24 structures, dormitories with barred windows, workshops where small hands labored over mining equipment, and at the town's heart, a railroad depot that pulsed with unnatural light. The children moved through the streets like sleepwalkers, their faces blank and their shoulders bent under invisible loads. "Dear God," Griffin whispered, his voice nearly lost in the locomotive's thunder as they descended the final grade. "How long have they been here?" "Some since just after Copper Ridge," Alara said, her knuckles white as she gripped the controls. "Others arrived more recently. The consortium never stops hunting for new stock." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Griffin saw tears cutting fresh tracks through the coal dust on her cheeks. That Remy's ghostly form flickered more urgently now, his ethereal substance growing thin as they approached the cursed town. "The rails end at the depot," he warned. "After that, you're on your own. I can't maintain form much longer in this place. Too much concentrated evil, too many innocent souls crying out for justice." Behind them, Barton's dark locomotive shrieked. Its hunting call, the sound bouncing off canyon walls like the cry of a banshee. The dead railroad commissioner's voice carried on the wind, amplified by supernatural forces. "You can't save them all, Alara. Choose wisely. Your life and your husband's freedom, or a futile gesture that will only add your names to our collection." There, locomotive screamed into Kiera Wells Depot with brakes shrieking protest, throwing sparks that illuminated faces pressed against workshop windows, children's faces, hollow-eyed and hopeful, watching their impossible rescue unfold. Griffin leaped from the cab before they'd fully stopped, his boots hitting the platform as Barton's engine thundered to a halt barely 20 yards behind them. "The children," Alara called out, her voice carrying that otherworldly musical quality that could speak to iron and steel. "Where are they kept?" A small figure detached itself from the shadows, a girl no more than 10, with tangled brown hair and eyes that had seen too much. "The dormitories," she whispered, pointing toward the largest building. "But the overseers will come. They always come when the trains arrive." As if summoned by her words, doors burst open across the town. Men emerged, some living, some clearly walking dead, all carrying weapons and wearing the satisfied expressions of those who'd profited from misery. Griffin counted at least 15, with more appearing by the second. "Griffin," Alara said, placing her hand against the depot's iron support pillar and speaking words that made the very air shimmer. "I need you to trust me one more time." "Always," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. She smiled, the first truly peaceful expression he'd seen on her face since their wedding day. "Then get the children to the train. All of them. No matter what happens to me, you get them out of here." Before Griffin could protest, Alara pressed both palms against the depot's iron framework and began to sing that it wasn't the Welsh language she'd spoken before, nor English, nor anything Griffin recognized. This was older, deeper, the voice of the earth itself, of mountains being born and rivers carving their paths to the sea. The sound resonated through every piece of metal in Kiera Wells, from railroad spikes to mining equipment to the very nails. Holding the buildings together, the effect was immediate and terrifying. Every iron surface in town began to glow with silver fire, pulsing in rhythm with Alara's voice. The dead men stumbled backward, their forms wavering like heat mirages, while the living overseers cried out in pain as metal tools became too hot to hold. The children, Griffin shouted to the girl. Bring them all. Now, she needed no further encouragement. Her voice rose in a cry that seemed to echo from every corner of the cursed town. Freedom! The rails have come for us. They came running, 47 children, just as Alara had said, pouring from dormitories and workshops like water from a broken dam. Some carried improvised weapons. Others helped smaller ones who could barely walk. All of them moved with the desperate speed of the long captives suddenly seeing daylight. Griffin herded them toward Remy's locomotive, which had somehow expanded to accommodate impossible numbers, boxcars materializing from moonlight and determination, passenger compartments, appearing wherever they were needed. The ghost engineer stood at his throttle, his form now so translucent Griffin could see the canyon walls through his chest. Hurry, Remy called. I can't hold this much longer. That's when Barton made his move. The dead railroad commissioner emerged from his dark engine carrying a weapon Griffin had never seen before, a railroad spike that burned with black fire, its iron twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Enough games, witch. Barton snarled, advancing on Alara with inhuman speed. You'll serve us willingly, or we'll break you and use the pieces. Griffin's colt barked 3 times, the bullets passing harmlessly through Barton's form. But the distraction was enough for Alara to complete whatever supernatural working she'd begun. Her voice rose to a crescendo that shattered every window in Kiera Wells, and the iron framework of the entire town began to sing in harmony. The cursed depot collapsed first, its support beams twisting into impossible spirals before crumbling to dust. Then the workshops, their metal tools and equipment dissolving like sugar in rain. The very rails that had brought them here began to buckle and flow, turning molten as Alara's song reached into the deepest foundations of the consortiums. Evil enterprise. All aboard, Remy shouted as his locomotive began to move, ghost steam building pressure in boilers that existed somewhere between memory and reality. Last call for the living. Griffin scooped up the brown-haired girl who'd first spoken to them, running for the train as Kiera Wells collapsed around them. Alara stumbled behind him. Her song finally ended, blood streaming from her nose and ears. The effort of destroying an entire town through force of will had nearly killed her. They tumbled into the locomotive's cab as Remy threw the throttle wide open. The ghost train leaped forward like a living thing, racing up the canyon walls on rails that appeared just ahead of their wheels and vanished moments after. Behind them, Kiera Wells finished its death throes in a cascade of collapsing stone and dissolving metal. Barton's final scream echoed off the canyon walls, not the cry of the defeated, but of something being pulled back into whatever hell had spawned it. His dark locomotive simply wasn't anymore, unraveled by the same forces that had destroyed his earthly enterprise. They rode the ghost rails through the remainder of the night, 47 rescued children chattering with the desperate joy of the newly freed, while Alara slept in Griffin's arms and Remy's form grew ever more translucent. As dawn approached, they found themselves back at Devil's Bend, the familiar depot house looking like the most beautiful sight in all creation. The children scattered to the 4 winds, carried by mysteriously appearing wagons driven by people Griffin didn't recognize, families who'd lost children to the consortium, he realized, finally getting their loved ones back. Others were met by territorial marshals who'd been searching for missing wards for years. As the last wagon disappeared into the desert sunrise, Remy tipped his conductor's cap to Griffin and Alara. My work's finished, he said, his voice fading. Like morning mist. Those children will find their way home, and the consortium's power is broken forever. The iron remembers justice now, instead of greed. He faded away with a smile, leaving behind only the scent of honest steam and the distant echo of a train whistle singing hymns. Griffin and Alara stood together on their depot platform, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and hope. Her real name was Alara Ellis. She'd killed good men through necessity and saved innocent children through courage, and she was his wife in every way that mattered. So, Griffin said, taking her hand and feeling the calluses that told the story of her strength. What now, Mrs. Tate? She leaned against his shoulder, finally at peace. Now we tend our depot, mind our trains, and remember that sometimes the rails lead exactly where they're supposed to. She paused, looking out at the endless tracks stretching toward horizons full of possibility. And maybe, if we're very lucky, we'll never hear another ghost train for the rest of our days. A freight whistle sounded in the distance, rail steam, honest iron, carrying nothing more dangerous than grain and cattle toward cities where children played in streets blessed by sunlight. Griffin kissed his wife's forehead and tasted jasmine and redemption. Sounds perfect to me. If this tale of love and redemption on the iron rails has stirred your heart, I'd be much obliged if you'd tip your hat with a like and share your thoughts below. For every story needs witnesses to make it true. And do tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether it's from the comfort of a parlor back east or a frontier town where the dust still settles slow and the sunset paints everything in shades of gold.